When a governance framework is first established, it can feel complete simply because roles are named, meetings are scheduled, and policies exist, but governance only earns trust when it is evaluated honestly and improved over time. The purpose of evaluation is not to prove that leadership was right or to create a stack of reports that look impressive, but to learn whether the governance system is actually producing the outcomes the enterprise expects. A well-meaning framework can still fail in practice if decision rights are unclear, if processes are bypassed under pressure, or if accountability exists on paper but not in behavior. Evaluation is how the enterprise finds gaps where something important is missing, overlaps where too many groups are doing the same work without coordination, and weak signals that warn of future failures before those failures become expensive incidents. For brand new learners, the most important shift is realizing that governance is not a set-and-forget structure, because enterprises change, risks change, and people change, and governance must adapt while preserving clarity. This episode will make evaluation feel like a repeatable leadership habit that keeps governance real. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical definition of governance evaluation is the disciplined effort to compare what governance intends to do with what governance actually does, using evidence from decisions, outcomes, and behaviors. That evidence can come from records of approvals, risk acceptances, and investment choices, but it can also come from patterns in performance, such as recurring incidents, repeated exceptions, or persistent confusion in ownership. Evaluation should answer questions that leaders can act on, such as whether decision checkpoints are being used consistently, whether the enterprise is getting the value promised from investments, and whether risk is being accepted deliberately rather than silently. It should also test whether governance is proportional, meaning high-impact decisions receive the right level of oversight while routine decisions flow efficiently. Beginners sometimes treat evaluation as an audit that happens only when something goes wrong, but governance evaluation is more like preventive maintenance, because it aims to detect small issues early and correct them while change is still easy. Another key point is that evaluation should focus on effectiveness, not only compliance with a process, because a process can be followed and still fail to produce the desired outcome. When evaluation is designed well, it creates a feedback loop that keeps governance aligned to enterprise direction. Before evaluating, it helps to understand what a gap is in governance terms, because gaps can hide behind activity. A gap is a missing element that governance needs to produce consistent outcomes, such as missing decision rights for a critical category of decisions, missing ownership for a key information asset, or missing monitoring for a control that leadership assumes is functioning. Gaps also include missing connections, such as a business case requirement that exists but is not tied to funding approvals, or a risk acceptance rule that exists but is not linked to escalation paths. One reason gaps are dangerous is that people often fill them informally, and informal workarounds can appear to solve the problem while actually creating inconsistent behavior and hidden risk. For example, if there is no clear owner for a shared data set, individuals may step in to fix issues, but because ownership is informal, the enterprise cannot rely on consistent quality and cannot enforce standards. Governance evaluation looks for gaps by asking where outcomes depend on heroics, where confusion repeats, and where decisions happen without a clear path. Beginners sometimes assume gaps will be obvious, but many gaps show up as recurring friction, repeated questions, and inconsistent decisions rather than as a single dramatic failure. Evaluation turns those signals into actionable findings. Overlaps are different from gaps, but they can be just as damaging because they create waste, confusion, and contradictory decisions. An overlap occurs when two or more groups believe they own the same decision or control responsibility, or when multiple processes exist for the same purpose without clear coordination. Overlaps can emerge when governance grows organically, such as when a new committee is added to solve a problem without clarifying how it relates to existing forums. They can also appear after reorganizations, when old responsibilities are not retired cleanly and new roles are added on top. Overlaps create inconsistent outcomes because different groups may apply different criteria, causing teams to receive mixed messages about what is required. Overlaps also slow decision speed because approvals may be duplicated or because teams must satisfy multiple reviewers who are not aligned. Evaluation identifies overlaps by mapping decisions to forums, responsibilities to roles, and controls to owners, then looking for duplicate ownership or conflicting authority. For beginners, the key idea is that more oversight is not always better oversight, because duplicated oversight often reduces accountability rather than increasing it. A governance framework becomes stronger when overlaps are resolved so authority and responsibility are clear. Weak signals are the most subtle and most valuable part of evaluation because they are early warnings that something is drifting before a major failure forces attention. A weak signal is a small pattern that suggests rising risk, declining control effectiveness, or weakening alignment, even if nothing has exploded yet. Weak signals can include a steady increase in exceptions to standards, repeated near misses where a control almost failed, recurring confusion about who owns a decision, or rising delays in decision forums that push teams toward workarounds. They can also include soft signals like stakeholder complaints that governance is unpredictable or repeated changes in priorities that suggest planning discipline is weakening. Beginners often think governance is only tested by big incidents, but big incidents often have a long lead up where weak signals were present and ignored. Governance evaluation treats these weak signals as valuable data because they allow leaders to correct course while the cost of correction is still low. Weak signals also help leaders avoid the trap of measuring only lagging outcomes, like a breach count, and instead measure conditions that make breaches more or less likely. When evaluation is designed to capture weak signals, governance becomes proactive rather than reactive. To evaluate effectively, governance needs criteria because without criteria, evaluation becomes opinion and politics. The criteria should reflect what the governance framework claims to deliver, such as alignment of investments to strategy, disciplined risk acceptance, consistent compliance behavior, and repeatable decision-making with clear accountability. The criteria should also reflect the framework's design elements, such as whether scope boundaries are clear, whether authority is legitimate and enforceable, and whether operating rhythm produces consistent oversight outputs. A practical approach is to define a small set of evaluation questions and then gather evidence for each question rather than trying to evaluate everything at once. Evidence might include whether major initiatives consistently have business cases, whether benefit tracking is performed after delivery, and whether risk acceptances are documented and revisited. If you choose to use metrics, it helps to introduce the idea of a key performance indicator, KPI, as a measure that leadership can review regularly to understand whether a process or outcome is on track. KPI choices should support decisions, meaning if the KPI moves in the wrong direction, leaders know what governance action to consider. Criteria keep evaluation grounded, making it easier to identify gaps, overlaps, and weak signals with credibility rather than with personal claims. One of the most practical evaluation techniques is decision tracing, which means following real decisions backward and forward to see whether governance behaved as designed. For example, take a recent funding decision and trace whether a business case existed, whether decision criteria were applied consistently, whether the right authority approved it, and whether benefit realization expectations were set. Then trace forward to see whether benefits were measured after delivery and whether corrective action occurred when benefits were weak. Decision tracing can also be applied to risk acceptance by examining whether a risk decision was escalated appropriately, whether the decision maker had the authority to accept that risk, and whether the risk was monitored afterward. This technique is powerful because it reveals whether governance processes exist only in policy or exist in practice. It also reveals where handoffs fail, such as when a project is delivered but no operational owner is prepared to manage it, leading to predictable incidents. Beginners sometimes assume you evaluate governance by reading documents, but documents often describe intention rather than behavior. Decision tracing forces evaluation into the real world where governance either works or does not work. Another essential technique is responsibility mapping, which means checking whether roles and responsibilities are defined clearly enough that accountability is visible and enforceable. Responsibility mapping examines whether owners exist for key information assets, key services, and key governance processes, and whether authority aligns with accountability. It also checks whether the enterprise has accidental shared ownership, where everyone is involved but no one is accountable, which often leads to chronic gaps. In this evaluation, overlaps show up when multiple roles claim the same ownership, while gaps show up when no role claims it or when ownership is unclear at boundaries. Responsibility mapping also helps find weak signals, such as repeated confusion about who approves exceptions or who owns data quality remediation. Beginners sometimes think role charts are sufficient, but evaluation asks whether people can actually describe their responsibilities and whether governance decisions can be made without personal negotiation. If the mapping reveals that accountability depends on informal relationships, governance is fragile and will fail under turnover or pressure. Responsibility mapping therefore connects directly to governance resilience, because a resilient framework can survive changes in personnel without losing clarity. When evaluation includes responsibility mapping, leadership can strengthen governance by clarifying ownership and resolving duplicated authority. Process evaluation is another major category because standard processes and decision checkpoints are what make governance repeatable. Process evaluation asks whether governance processes are actually used, whether they produce consistent outputs, and whether they are proportional to risk and impact. For example, a change oversight process might exist, but if high-risk changes bypass review due to urgency, the process is not functioning as a control. A funding process might exist, but if investments are approved without consistent criteria, the process is not producing alignment. Process evaluation also checks whether checkpoints are placed in the right spots, because checkpoints that happen too late cannot prevent lock-in, and checkpoints that happen too often can create bottlenecks that drive workarounds. Weak signals in process evaluation include growing cycle time for approvals, repeated emergency approvals, and a rising number of undocumented decisions. Overlaps can appear when multiple review steps exist for the same decision without clear purpose, leading to duplicated scrutiny and slow speed. Gaps can appear when there is no checkpoint for a critical decision category, leaving the enterprise blind until a failure occurs. Beginners should understand that process evaluation is not about blaming teams. It is about designing governance so that the safest path is also the easiest path. Metrics and monitoring are useful, but they must be chosen carefully to avoid turning evaluation into a scoreboard game. Governance metrics should include both outcome measures and condition measures, where condition measures are the weak signals that warn of drift. Outcome measures might include whether benefits are realized as promised, whether major incidents decline, or whether audit results improve, but these often lag behind reality. Condition measures might include the volume and age of unresolved high-risk issues, the trend of exceptions to standards, the proportion of investments with defined measures, and the stability of priorities over time. Another condition measure is the quality of evidence, such as whether approvals and risk decisions are consistently documented and traceable. Metrics should also highlight overlaps and gaps, such as multiple processes producing different reports for the same purpose or missing reports for critical governance outcomes. Beginners sometimes assume more metrics create better governance, but too many metrics can create noise and distract from action. The goal is a set of measures that leaders can review regularly and use to drive decisions, such as strengthening a control, adjusting a process, or reallocating resources to address a persistent gap. When metrics are tied to action, evaluation becomes a driver of improvement rather than a reporting ritual. Interviews and stakeholder feedback are surprisingly powerful in governance evaluation because governance is a human system, and people experience its effectiveness through friction, clarity, and trust. Talking to stakeholders across business and IT can reveal whether decision rights are understood, whether processes feel usable, and whether governance is seen as legitimate. Feedback can also reveal weak signals that metrics might miss, such as a culture of bypassing governance or a belief that exception approvals depend on personal influence. Interviews can uncover overlaps when multiple groups describe owning the same decision, and they can uncover gaps when everyone assumes another group owns it. For beginners, it is important to treat stakeholder input as evidence that must be validated, not as unquestionable truth, because perceptions can be biased, but patterns across multiple stakeholders are valuable signals. Feedback also helps identify where governance is misaligned with enterprise pace, such as when approval cycles are too slow and teams are driven into unsafe shortcuts. Governance evaluation that ignores human experience often misses the reason processes fail in practice, because people's behavior under pressure determines whether governance controls are followed. When evaluation includes stakeholder input, improvements can focus on clarity and usability, which increases adherence and reduces bypass behavior. Once gaps, overlaps, and weak signals are identified, evaluation must lead to remediation planning, because evaluation without follow-through becomes another governance failure. Remediation planning means prioritizing issues based on impact and risk, assigning accountable owners, setting realistic timelines, and defining how progress will be monitored. Gaps that create high risk, such as missing ownership for critical information assets or missing risk acceptance authority, should be addressed quickly because they can lead to severe outcomes. Overlaps that create inconsistent decisions and slow approvals should be simplified so governance becomes clearer and faster, reducing workarounds. Weak signals should be treated as early warnings that justify preventive action, such as refining decision checkpoints, increasing clarity in exception handling, or improving evidence practices before external scrutiny exposes weaknesses. Remediation also needs to be proportional, because fixing everything at once can overwhelm the enterprise and reduce credibility. Beginners sometimes assume governance improvement means adding more steps, but remediation often means simplifying, clarifying, and strengthening the link between decisions and outcomes. Effective remediation turns evaluation into continuous improvement, making governance stronger over time. To close, evaluating your governance framework to find gaps, overlaps, and weak signals means treating governance as a living system that must be tested against real behavior and real outcomes, not merely described in policies. Evaluation identifies gaps where ownership, decision rights, or monitoring is missing, overlaps where duplicated authority and processes create waste and confusion, and weak signals that warn of drift before failures become crises. Effective evaluation uses clear criteria, traces real decisions, maps responsibilities, reviews processes and checkpoints, and selects meaningful KPI measures that drive action rather than noise. It also listens to stakeholder experience to understand whether governance is usable and legitimate in daily work, because governance is only real when people follow it under pressure. The most important result of evaluation is remediation that assigns owners and strengthens governance in a proportional, practical way, so clarity increases while bureaucracy does not. When you learn to evaluate governance this way, you gain a core CGEIT skill, the ability to improve governance continuously so it remains aligned, enforceable, and resilient as the enterprise and its risks evolve.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.